Hello, my name is Mary-Ann Stephenson, and I'm going to be talking about the Women's Budget Group analysis of the 2024 spring budget and the implications that it'll have for women in the UK. So, the Chancellor presented this as a budget for long-term growth. He argued that the budget involved more investment, more jobs, better public services, and lower taxes. In actual fact, it was a fairly thin budget. There was very little long-term planning in it. There were some significant tax cuts, which we'll come on to later. But the real decisions about spending on public services and actually dealing with our crisis in public services were kicked down the road to a spending review, which will apparently take place after the next election. There was a lot of play before the budget about this question of fiscal headroom, whether or not Jeremy Hunt would have the fiscal headroom that he needed to make the tax cuts he wanted to make. Now, this idea of fiscal headroom is based on the Chancellor's fiscal rules, which is the sort of rules which he has set for himself, which incidentally have changed several times over successive parliaments. The current rules we have is that debt should be falling as a share of gross domestic product by the last year of a 5-year forecast. So in order to meet these fiscal rules, Jeremy Hunt pointed to the fact that the Office of Budget Responsibility had forecast that the economy was going to grow slightly more quickly than was forecast in November, and inflation was going to fall slightly more quickly. And this gave him the necessary headroom in order to make the tax cuts that he wanted to make. I mean, there are 2 points that we would make here. First of all, we don't think these particular fiscal rules are helpful. They ignore the need for long-term investment, particularly investment in social infrastructure. And they're also based on forecasts which, as we can see from the OBR's own report in detail, are far less reliable than Jeremy Hunt's confident assertion that inflation will fall faster than predicted and the economy will grow faster might lead us to assume. So if we look first at inflation, the solid black line here, as you can see, is showing that the Office of Budget Responsibility is forecasting that inflation will fall slightly faster than they had forecast in November. And that would be good news for families struggling with the cost of living. However, if you look at this sort of zone of uncertainty in the OBR forecasts, you can see that the difference between the two lines is relatively small. And the potential range by which the forecasts could vary is quite large. And this is to take into account the fact that, previous forecasts have been unreliable. Forecasting anything 5 years ahead is a difficult job. And so making great play of this relatively small difference doesn't seem that realistic when you're looking over a longer term. There's a similar issue with what the Office of Budget Responsibility forecast would happen with gross domestic product. That's the total value of goods and services bought and sold in the economy. Now, we don't think at the Women's Budget Group that GDP is the best measure of a healthy economy. It doesn't take into account unpaid work, for example. It doesn't take into account the impact of the environment or on human well-being. But it is the measure that the Chancellor is using to decide how healthy the economy is. And again, he's saying, if you look at this black line here, the GDP should grow slightly higher, faster than was forecast in November. But again, looking at this zone of uncertainty, it doesn't seem really clear that he can be all that confident that that's definitely going to happen. So this seems like a poor basis on which to make longer term decisions. We also think, when you're thinking about inflation, it's important not just to think about the Consumer Prices Index, which is the standard basket of goods that the Office for National Statistics compares periodically to see what's happened to its price, and that's a sort of standard measure of inflation, but to look at what's happened to those goods which particularly the poorest families might need to spend more of their income on. So, for example, if you look at food inflation, a year ago, last March, food inflation was at over 19%. It's still at 7% in January this year. And when we know that poorer families spend a higher proportion of their income on food than richer families, you can see that that's going to affect poorer families more. The other thing we think it's important to look at is the household costs index. So this is a slightly different set of goods that the Office for National Statistics has developed as a way of looking at what might be a more realistic reflection of the sorts of goods the average household might be buying. And you can see here that the household goods measure was at 5% in November, which is higher than the CPI inflation rate. And that's important because we can see that there's a real problem with living standards in this country at the moment and poverty. Some of that caused by rising prices, some of that caused by incomes having fallen in real terms. So real disposable income was 3.5% lower in 2024-25 than before the pandemic. But we also, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, have 3.8 million people living in destitution in 2022. So that's not just relative poverty, that's absolute destitution. And that includes 1 million children. In fact, the number of children in destitution has increased by 186% since 2017. And lone parents in particular are vulnerable to poverty and destitution because they only have one income, and it's harder to work full-time because they've got no one to share childcare with. So you can see lone parents in destitution have increased to over 190,000 in 2022. And this is significant when we look at the next chart. So this is our analysis of the 2p cut to national insurance contributions that was announced in the budget. And this comes on top of a previous 2p cut to national insurance that was announced in November. So there's a total of 4p taken from national insurance contributions. And we've done an analysis at the Women's Budget Group of who benefits the most from this cut. And you can see lone mothers here only stands to gain £85 a year from the decision that was announced in the March budget, and that's on top of a £76 that they would have gained from November. Compare that to the benefits that a single man will gain, over £660 a year, or indeed a couple with no children, over £12,000 a year. So you can see when you've got a group of people like lone parents who are particularly vulnerable to rising costs and low incomes, this national insurance contribution cut doesn't really do very much for them. At the same time, what the Chancellor didn't really talk about was what his long-term spending plans are for government departments. He maintained his commitment to increase spending on public services by 1% a year. There were some rumours that it might be cut to 0.75% in order to give him more of this fiscal headroom that we discussed earlier. But inflation has eroded the budget for public services. And we also have an ageing population, which means that demand for services, particularly things like health and adult social care, will go up. Now, if you look at those departments where we do have some certainty about spending, and there's been some protection in spending, for example, the NHS, spending on defence, spending on overseas development, and a significant increase in spending on early education and childcare. What that means is other departments are likely to see a significant cut to their budget. So overall, 2.3% cut in real terms in day-to-day spending from 2025-26 onwards. And these departments include local government. Now, this is particularly worrying because local government has been one of the areas most exposed to spending cuts since 2010. So austerity cuts since 2010 have dramatically decreased the spending power of local authorities. Grants from local government have fallen. Local authorities have had to put up council tax quite significantly, which means the overall decrease in spending power is about 27% since 2010. And when you see that we have increased demand for services, as I said, from an ageing population, you can see that playing out in the crisis that very many local authorities are warning about at the moment. So over 60 English councils have warned that they could declare bankruptcy in the next year. We've already seen the crisis in Birmingham City Council, which has had to cut social care, children's services, other non-statutory services, and is cutting up to 600 jobs directly. We're seeing cuts to services for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And even in order to meet this budget with the cuts that they're making, Birmingham is going to have to put up its council tax by 21% from next year. So those people who may be looking forward to a gain in from cuts to national insurance contributions will be seeing a significant increase in their council tax. I said I wanted to say a little bit more about violence against women and girls services. There was no new money for domestic and sexual violence services announced in the budget this year. And this is in a context of very, very worrying time with rising demand and real problems that those services have in meeting that demand. So Women's Aid reported that recently that 60% of referrals to refuges have to be turned away because there simply aren't enough beds. There are 14,000 survivors of sexual violence on the rape crisis waiting list. Some rape crisis centres have had to close their waiting lists. And services led by and for Black and minoritized women are 6 times more likely to receive funding, less likely to receive funding compared to other domestic abuse services. Now, there were some things in the budget that we were pleased to see, one of which was the change to the child benefit higher income threshold. This wouldn't necessarily have been our first priority for government to spend money on in terms of helping the poorest families. There are families in much deeper poverty. However, we have long called for child benefit to be taken out of the means test. We think that having child benefit as a non-means tested universal benefit is cheaper to administer. It means people are more likely to claim it. We know that there's a problem at the moment with some women not claiming child benefit because their partners are higher earners, but actually child benefit is a passporting benefit that credits you with national insurance contributions if you're not working, if you're at home looking after a child, if you're not in paid work. So not claiming child benefit can actually be bad for women's pension in the long term. We're also really conscious that there is this anomaly, which is that a lone parent in who's earning over £50,000 will start to see their child benefit taken away, whereas a couple household with 2 partners earning just under £50,000 a year, so with a household income of nearly £100,000, would continue to receive child benefit. And for lone parents, this can be a particular problem. You know, £50,000 a year is a very good salary. But if you look at the spiralling cost of living in London at the moment, monthly take-home pay on a salary of £50,000 a year is about £3,100 a month. When you add up the cost of rent for a 2-bedroom property, if you've got a child, £1,650 on average. A full-time place for a child under 2, £1,700 a month. And the average cost of energy per person, over £186 a month. That comes to a total cost of over £3,500, significantly more than the monthly take-home pay of a lone parent. So you can see that even those who are relatively well off may in fact need some additional support with the cost of having children. The other thing that we welcomed was the abolition of the non-dom status. Non-DOMs receive over 10 billion a year annually in offshore income and capital gains that aren't subject to taxation in the UK. And taxing this income would result in additional revenue, which could be spent on vital public services. And it's also worth pointing out that 67% of non-domiciled taxpayers are men. So this has an advantage of narrowing the gender wealth gap. We also welcomed the commitment to index payments for the funded hours for early education and childcare. This provides certainty for providers and is something that we have been calling for. However, it doesn't deal with the underlying problem that the amount of money that the government pays to providers to deliver the funded hours is less than the cost of providing those hours. We've calculated that it would take an extra £5 billion a year to fund the promised free childcare hours. Without that, the sector, which is already in crisis, 57% of nursery staff and 38% of childminders are considering leaving childcare in the next year, which means it's going to be very difficult for the government to get its planned expansion that it wants to see. So in summary, the Chancellor presented this as a good news budget, that we were seeing falling inflation and additional money for tax cuts. The Office for Budget Responsibility report was far more cautious about these forecasts than the Chancellor presented them. And it also highlighted the fact that there's going to be cuts for non-protected departments from 2025-26 onwards built into the Chancellor's plans. But again, there was no detail about how those cuts would be made, where they would fall. And indeed, it's been announced that there won't be a spending review until after the next election. So that can has definitely been kicked down the road. So as with the autumn statement, we saw again tax cuts that will benefit men more than women, while underfunding of public services hitting women hardest. And there was nothing at all in the budget about the climate emergency that we are facing at the moment. The hottest February worldwide on record this year, following successive records for hottest months. We really need to recognise and take urgent action to address and mitigate what's happening with climate change. Nor did the budget mention the crisis in social care, which is leading very many people to be left with unmet care needs, and others having to work very long hours providing unpaid care. Thank you very much.